Well, good morning. I am Dave. I was referred to earlier. I used to pastor this place. I am David. I'm Jacob and Chantal's dad. I'm retired, and I'm really good at being retired. I just want you to know that. It's a fun gig. Look forward to it. Look forward to it. I want to pray before I get going. Father, you are good, and we know that. And I want us to wrestle with the idea that you're in this room and you're here to love us, to meet us, to heal us, to set us free, to work in ways that we didn't even know we needed you to work. So have your way in this place, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. So I met Jesus when I was almost 22 years old. By that time, I had gotten myself so entangled with all kinds of things that I was what you would nicely call broken. You would not so nicely say was dysfunctional. I was a mess, and then I met Jesus. And man, did he do something to me that radically changed my life. And one of the ways that I have always been impacted is through music. So I feel sorry for the youth of today who spend so much time on their devices and playing video games when you could be listening to music. And you know, I would have never made it through that 7th grade breakup had it not been for Crimson and Clover. I wept through that. My heart was broken. But as you can see, I survived. As a matter of fact, this whole gift to the world was started when I listened at a Christian conference to a guy by the name of Bono. He was the lead singer of U2, and I'd heard that he was having a little faith journey, and I wondered if it was really real or just something that he was making up. But in the midst of that faith journey, he started to see all of these injustices in the world. And he said, why is that so? He began to recognize that every 6 minutes, a child dies of a waterborne disease. Every 6 minutes, a child dies of a waterborne disease. And he asks, where's the church? Where is the church in the midst of this injustice? Man, that rattled me because I was leading a church. And that's where Gift to the World broke out. And I saw him multiple years later, and he said, whoa, man, when you challenge the church rises up. This little church has given clean water to over 60,000 people. And human trafficking began to be a big deal, so we've identified somebody that is really reaching in. These are Christian organizations taking Christ into the midst of this chaos and doing great things. So again, I'm grateful to be a part of a church that wants to be the church and not just talk about what it looks like to be church. Now, I'm taking you to the book of Isaiah today, and this is a book and an individual that was a radical part of God changing my life. Because Isaiah, the prophet, 600 years before Jesus, lived in a time of chaos, much like the world has always been and always will be until Jesus returns. But the interesting thing about Isaiah is that he knew the arrogant rich, but he also saw the suffering poor. And the world was in chaos, war was breaking out, and God began to speak to him. And he had this overwhelming sense of God's holiness. This is a sovereign God. And he must have looked in the mirror because he knew that he did not measure up to or even come close to this sovereign God. So he had what some would probably describe as a healthy fear of God. I don't measure up. And that led him to this frantic need to find out how to get himself back into right relationship with God. And what was interesting is he saw his whole people group, the Jewish people, in the same condition that he was in. We would call them unsavable. I was on many people's unsavable list. He'll never know Jesus. Some, after I did get to know Jesus, and even today, 40 years later, don't believe that it's possible that I came to know Jesus. And it's interesting the way Isaiah puts his book together, because it isn't until chapter 6 that he comes to this place. In the midst of all of this chaos that is everywhere, he has this vision, and this vision is of heaven, and he sees the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted. He's overwhelmed with this picture. His robe spills off of him and fills the whole temple. And there are these wild-looking angelic beings who are singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And as they're singing, the whole temple is shaking. And as he sees this, he just goes, "Woe is me." I have this picture of him dropping on his face. And he declares in that setting, "I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people who are the same as me. I shouldn't even be looking upon you." And one of those angelic beings takes some tongs and pulls a coal out of the altar, burning hot, and takes it to Isaiah and touches his lips with it. And says to him, "Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for." So in other words, is taken care of. I think it's important to understand what sin is, because I'm a sinner. I've got lots of sins, little boxes I could check behind descriptive words that talk about my dysfunction and my brokenness. But really what sin is just falling short of the glory of God. I don't measure up. I never will measure up. It's an impossibility for me. And then interestingly, as all of that is happening, the Lord says, "Who shall I send? Who will go for us?" With this message of healing and forgiveness, shame being taken care of, guilt being taken care of, sin being forgiven. Who will take this message? And it's here that Isaiah says, "Here I am, send me." Adam in the first service talked about you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing. You just have to be willing. I heard this a long time ago. I use it a lot. God isn't interested in where you've been. He's only concerned with where you're going. So here I am. Use me. I'm willing. Man, I connected to this story. I realized because it was early in my Christian life and I was still wildly broken and dysfunctional. But I began to serve Jesus. And if you really want to experience life, start serving Jesus. Because God isn't interested in where you've been. He's interested in where you're going. So we've talked about these promises, the fulfillment of Christ, and we've talked about the kingly promise. We've talked about Moses. We've talked about Adam. Today I want to talk about this one that is called the suffering servant. And this is interesting. I encourage you to read chapters 52 and 53 of Isaiah, because I can't read the whole thing and stay in my time limit. But in chapter 52, it says this: "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns." He's talking because he's just about to indulge us in a song that he's created prophetically. It's called the Suffering Servant Song. But he's talking about this good news that is coming through this suffering servant. And I think he's forecasting to us that that's what we have to be, the ones that carry the good news. So there are prophetic and redemptive and priestly and kingly streams that all flow towards this rushing river of expectations of what the Messiah is going to look like, what he would be like. And they are fulfilled in Jesus. At least 300 of them have been fulfilled in Jesus. There are more that will be fulfilled in his second coming, which, if you didn't know this, he's coming back. We celebrate at Christmas, Advent, his coming, that he's coming back. But here's what's interesting about this conversation about the suffering servant. This one was missed by almost everybody. This one caught everybody by surprise when Jesus came, because no one imagined that the Messiah would come to suffer and to die on a cross. Nobody saw that coming. It was actually scandalizing when they started to declare this was the Messiah, that this suffering Jesus was actually God in the flesh. That was a scandal. People weren't even ready to consider the possibility that God himself would come to earth as this great high priest and then offer himself as a perfect sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin, and then would be victorious as he defeats sin and death, rises from the grave, and ascends to the right hand of the Father. You know what's interesting? Is even his closest followers didn't get it. They didn't get it. They went and hid because they didn't understand it. And then they started, in retrospect, going back through the prophetic messages, ended up in Isaiah, and in chapters 42, 49, 50, and 52 and 53 began to realize, oh my gosh, we missed it. This is the Messiah, the surprise of the suffering servant. And what they discovered is he really was sent to suffer and die. And in his suffering, he suffered on our behalf. He had to suffer so that we could have life and life to the full. And in that suffering, he was also rejected and humiliated, and yet vindicated and exalted. And this suffering brought justice, and it brought salvation, and it brought blessing to everyone. It was no longer one little people group, the Jewish people, the Hebrew people. It was everyone, all mankind. So as I'm pulling from this chapter of Isaiah, again, I want to understand it's a song. It's a song. Again, the music. I got a special piece of music at the end for you. Fortunately for you, I'm not singing it. But it's one of my favorite songs. And it's not Jesus Take the Wheel. Somebody asked me, is it Jesus Take the Wheel? I like that one a lot, but it's not that one. But he preceded that song with this statement, "Are beautiful are the feet of his messenger who brings good news, who announces salvation." And then he goes on as his song begins to say that my servant shall prosper. So in other words, he will succeed. My servant will succeed. He will do this. He will take care of this. He will bring salvation. And there will be this threefold blessing. He'll be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, which is language that reflects a coronation, an exaltation of a king, exalted in God's presence. But then the song turns and says, but it will be done in a backdrop of suffering. Isaiah says his appearance will be so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. If you aren't familiar with Jesus' passion, he was physically beaten beyond recognition. He didn't fight back. He didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't cower. His face was so disfigured, I don't think he could see. And they took it's called a cat of nine tails, which is a whip that has 9 pieces of leather coming from it. On the ends of those pieces of leather is glass and bone and metal. And they dip it in goat's blood, and they lash those that they're crucifying. And as they lash, they make sure that those barbs at the end of that leather strand stick, and then they rip them through the flesh on those that are being beaten. He was marred. He was disfigured beyond that of any man. The song continues, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Again, if you know the story, it was one of his closest friends that betrayed him. He was mocked, he was beaten, he was hung on a cross, literally naked, in one of the busiest intersections in Jerusalem. And the people there mocked and spit on him. And the song says he did it for us. Surely he took our infirmities and carried our sorrows. So again, as the early followers of Jesus started to look back at Isaiah's song, they're going, oh, it really was Jesus. Remember, the spear went into his side. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. And by his wounds, we are healed. This is how God righted our story. This is how God opened the door for our admittance into his presence again. This is how God spanned that chasm that we could never span on our own. And Jesus knew this was coming and willfully walked into it. In the garden, moments before he was arrested, he said, Lord, not my will, but your will be done. He wanted it to pass over, but it didn't. And as the song closes, it says, my righteous servant will justify many. It's critical if you are a Christ follower or investigating what it means to be a Christ follower that you understand this. He suffered because there was a justice that needed to be atoned for, and it needed to be a perfect sacrifice. He fulfills 300 plus prophecies. And the church has understood this from the moment that the early Christians figured it out until today. Plan is accomplished. When Matthew was writing about Jesus as he was healing the sick and casting out demons, he said this, he took our infirmities and bore our diseases. After his resurrection, Philip was on the road and an Ethiopian went by in a chariot, and he heard the Ethiopian either reading or being read to this song, and Philip ran over to him and said, of Jesus, he is like a sheep that is being led to slaughter, like a lamb is silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. And then Philip climbed into that chariot with the Ethiopian and explained the gospel, and they stopped. And that Ethiopian was baptized and gave his life to Jesus, the first African descent Christ follower. And that's important because it does signify the global multi-ethnic reach of redemption that is found in Jesus. Peter, the first head of the church, said he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. Again, this is critical as we wander into this Christmas, as you're trying to discern and determine, how do I bring Jesus into my Christmas? Well, recognize what he did on your behalf and what Christmas represents. Because as that baby was laid in a manger, 30 years later, he was going to hang on a cross. And a few days after that, he was going to rise from the dead. And over 500 people saw him wandering the earth and watched as he ascended to the right hand of the Father. Witnesses. This is not legend, this is real. So Jesus was exalted through humiliation, victorious through apparent defeat. He was both priest and sacrifice. And these are all themes and that figure into what the Old Testament brought to us. And it's all brought together and fulfilled in the life and the work of the suffering servant whose name is Jesus. This is a strange design, don't you think? I mean, it really is. You wonder why the world kind of wonders, what's up with those guys? It's pretty, I wouldn't have done it this way. But here's what the suffering servant does. We finally begin to see the full contours of God's great plan for redemption and salvation. In the gift of God's Son to the world, Christmas celebrated, one born to suffer and die, we fully know and can comprehend the love of God. This is going to be on the screen because I think it's the most important takeaway for today. It is love alone that transforms us. Love alone that transforms us. I told you I had a special piece of music, so the worship team's going to come up and sing this for you. I'm excited for you to hear this special piece of music because my hope is that you connect to the words of this song and it causes you to do some introspection and maybe some work with Jesus. But here's what I know about the world we live in. Love, way too often, disappoints us. Our parents did not love us the way we know we needed to be loved. For many, we've sought love from all kinds of places because of that and because of other things, and that love has not fulfilled us. Some of us have had pretty incredible marriages, but we still know that it's not that love that fulfills us. It's only the love of Jesus, of God, that transforms us. In Jesus, the fullness of God's love is revealed, and it is love alone that transforms us. You know, we seldom hate our sin enough to leave it, which is why we need God's love to transform us.